Hello and welcome to the video. Those familiar with this channel will know that all the videos on it are concealed within 3 playlists. All of them are about Shakespeare. One of those playlists is called Who Knew, and it contains evidence from contemporaries who knew that William Shakespeare was the pseudonym being used by Edward de Vere, the Earl of Oxford. Another playlist is called Shocking Points, and that is predominantly containing videos about the personal scandal which Shakespeare obliquely alludes to in the sonnets. And the third playlist, Where Was He Really Buried?, contains a number of videos giving evidence that Shakespeare is not buried where he's supposed to be buried, in the Holy Trinity Church at Stratford-upon-Avon, but is in fact interred in Poets' Corner, Westminster Abbey. I'm going to take 2 of these ideas today. Who knew where he was really buried? I want to look at the thread of knowledge that links the moment where he was buried to the moment where this monument is placed upon the grave of Edward de Vere in 1740 by 3 conspirators, namely Lord Burlington, the patron and architect, his friend William Kent, who was a designer, and his friend Alexander Pope, the poet. These 3 were largely responsible for placing that monument on top of Edward de Vere's grave. So they must have known he was there. All 3 of them were Freemasons, and Lord Burlington was also a member of the Royal Society. The Royal Society was founded in the 1660s, ostensibly to investigate natural philosophy and the natural sciences, under a charter provided by Charles II, who was himself a Freemason. And the links between the Royal Society and Freemasonry are multiple. In the 20 years running up to the placing of this monument on Oxford's grave, you will find that all of the Grand Masters of the Masonic Lodge of London were members of the Royal Society. In 1730, there were 97 Freemasons, known Freemasons, who were members of the Royal Society. So the Royal Society, which developed out of several secret societies, including the Invisible College and various other mainly knowledge-seeking societies, very closely linked to the Freemasons. So what we're going to do is have a look at the 16th century witnesses. We start with this. I've shown it to you before. It is the title page of Shakespeare's sonnets and the dedication page of the same. The dedication page in 3 triangles, very Masonic, Royal Arch. So we know it's Masonic, and we know now that it is encrypted and is hiding some very specific information of the exact spot where Shakespeare is buried in Westminster Abbey, and also the identity of William Shakespeare 4 times on these 2 pages as the Earl of Oxford. I'm not going to go over this now because it would take too long. I have put up a video called Where is Shakespeare Really Buried? Part 1, and that takes you very carefully through these encryptions and shows you how they work and shows you how absolutely solid they are. If you've seen that and can't quite face seeing it again because it's 50 minutes long, can I recommend 4 minutes and 20 seconds of a video called In Contemplation of the Cryptic Mind, which simply gives a memoir, an aid memoir to the highlights, with beautiful music by Thomas Tallis. This, of course, consists of 3 encryptions, each one, you'll see if you look at those videos, signed by John Dee. John Dee is often cited as a precursor to the Masonic movement, as a person who instigated the philosophy of Rosicrucianism in Europe. You can see, if you look carefully at what he's holding, it's a compass, just like Lord Burlington was holding in his picture. And you can see a compass and a square on the table there. Absolutely sine qua non, the signs of Freemasonry. And also what looks like the ground plan of a Masonic lodge. At least that's exactly how Masonic lodges used to look before their plan was changed to look more like the Temple of Solomon. But in the olden days, they looked like they were cruciform like that. So again, we're connecting Freemasonry to the knowledge that Shakespeare is not buried where we think he is, very close to this unattractive monument. Our second witness, of course, is this, and I'm sorry to come back to things I've already shown. There will be a lot of new stuff on this programme as well, but it's our second witness to the fact that Shakespeare is not buried in Stratford. If you want the full details, look at the upload video Monkey Business at Stratford upon Avon. I'm just going to give you a very short reminder. But first, the link to Freemasonry, you see it really in the bottom right-hand corner. Those 4 T's marshalled like that. That's known as a tetragrammaton, using 4 letters, each actually the symbol of God or Christ, to form a united symbol of the Godhead, a very Masonic symbol. Just to give you a quick reminder of how we know that it's telling us that Shakespeare is buried in Westminster Abbey, we look at the 2nd and 3rd lines of the English part of the epitaph. Read if thou canst whom envious death hath placed within this monument. Shakespeare. I don't call that very good syntax. If you rearrange the sentence, you find the riddle that it's asking you in this monument. Read if thou canst whom envious death hath placed with Shakespeare. In other words, who is Shakespeare buried with? See if you can work it out by reading this monument. Well, terra tegit's a big clue, because that means earth covers, and then you find 3 allusions. The first to Francis Beaumont, the second to Geoffrey Chaucer, and the third to Edmund Spenser, who are buried in exactly that lineup in Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey. Again, if you want to know how these allusions refer, the classical allusions, how they refer to these 3 English poets, please look at Monkey Business in Stratford upon Avon, and things are explained there. I'll just give you the translation of the Latin. Earth covers, people mourn, and Olympus holds the pillion with his judgment, Socrates with his genius, and Virgil with his art. Okay, so that's our second witness to the fact that Shakespeare is buried in Westminster, and once again it is a Masonic witness. If we just move forward about 4 or 5 years to 1623 and the publication of Shakespeare's first folio, we look at the prefatory pages in this very famous poem by Ben Jonson, addressed to my Shakespeare. Thou art a monument without a tomb, implying that there is no gravestone. If we go forward now 7 years, this was actually published in 1632, but we know of the poem at the bottom there, written by John Milton, that it was written in 1630, so it's seven years after the first folio. And Milton writes to Shakespeare, what need my Shakespeare of his honoured bones, the labour of an age in piled stones, or that his hallowed relics should be hid under a star-appointing pyramid? Dear son of memory, great heir of fame, what needst thou such dull witness of thy name? Thou in our wonder and astonishment hast built thyself a lasting monument. So Milton is saying precisely the same as Ben Jonson was saying 7 years earlier. Your work is your monument, Shakespeare. Doesn't matter that you don't actually have a stone with your name upon it. So just from the 4 witnesses I've shown you so far, we know that 2 of them are saying that Shakespeare is buried in Westminster Abbey, and 2 of them are saying that he doesn't have a monument with his name on it. I should say that if you look in the archives of Freemasonry, you find the Freemasons very much claiming both Ben Jonson and John Milton as brethrens, and the Masons have lodges, the John Milton Lodge, Ben Jonson Lodge, etc. I'm going to move forward now 6 years to this poem in remembrance of Master William Shakespeare. I've gone through each of the 3 verses in a presentation called William Davenant Knew. Do have a look at that. It shows how William Davenant knew that Edward de Vere, Earl of Oxford, was Shakespeare. But I'm not going to go into that aspect of it now. We're just talking about where Shakespeare's buried. The poem is called In Remembrance of Master William Shakespeare, and it begins with a stark warning to delighted poets. That's poets who are in darkness, in ignorance, who have had the light taken away from them. And it says, beware, delighted poets, when you sing to welcome nature in the early spring, your numerous feet not tread the banks of Avon. Do not go up to Stratford upon Avon in remembrance of Master William Shakespeare, or your eyes will be mocked. You will be deceived by what you observe there. And this, therefore, is our 5th witness to the fact that there is something dodgy about the claim that Shakespeare is buried in Stratford upon Avon. Was William Davenant a Freemason? I haven't been able to find much on this, but there was in 1780 a pantomime, as it was called, a great stage performance put on in a theatre in London called Harlequin Freemason by a whole bunch of Freemasons, and one part of it involves a great procession with banners, and each part of that procession represents a different Grand Master of Freemasonry, going right back in history to Hiram Abif and King Solomon. And as you get through, you'll see the 14th banner here, King James I, who was known to be a Freemason, and his sidekick Inigo Jones, and the 15th banner has Charles II, as I said, a Freemason, and Sir William Davenant. So there is evidence that Davenant was indeed a Freemason, and that's how he too would have known that Shakespeare was not buried in Stratford-upon-Avon. We move forward 12 years now to the publication of this book of epigrams by Samuel Shepherd. I'm immensely grateful to my dear friend, the brilliant scholar Roger Strittmatter, for bringing this to my attention. He and I have actually finished writing an enormous book on Shakespearean allusions together, and this was one that he uncovered. It's Epigram 17, in memory of our famous Shakespeare. Of course, it's the 17th epigram because Shepherd is trying to align it by number to the 17th Earl of Oxford. I'm not going to look at the first 5 verses, as interesting as they are, because we're sticking with the subject of where Shakespeare's buried, so I'm going to skip straight to the final verse, which is verse 6. Where thy honoured bones do lie, as Startius once to Marrow's urn, thither every year will I slowly tread and sadly mourn. Notice he talks about slowly treading to Shakespeare's grave once a year. Shepherd knew more about poets and poetry than almost anyone of his age, and his works are an absolute mine of information about poets and poetry. It seems absolutely impossible to me that he would not have known the Davenant poem that I've just shown you. Remember, it warns poets to beware your numerous feet not tread the banks of Avon in remembrance of Master William Shakespeare, or your eyes will be mocked. So Davenant obviously knew that poem, and he clearly understood it, and he's alluding to it when he says he's going to tread every year to Shakespeare's tomb. But is he going to tread up to Stratford-upon-Avon and have his eyes mocked, as Davenant warned that he would? Well, of course he's not. He's brighter than that, and there's a clue that he's not going to go to Stratford-on-Avon, and that is in the second line, as Startius once to Marrow's urn. This is a reference to the classical poet Startius, who wrote Sylvae, in which he talks about going to read out a poem at Marrow's, that's Virgil's tomb, and he describes where it is, close to the foot of Mount Vesuvius. The mob generally was going 2 miles further north from there, 2 miles north of Naples, on the hill of Posillipo, over the entrance to a grotto on the road to Puteoli. That's where everybody else was going, just like in English times, everybody trogging up to Stratford-upon-Avon. In classical times, everyone was going to Virgil's tomb in the wrong place, and Startius seemed to have particular information about that. This was brought to light in this 1624 book by Philip Cluver, the geographer, and was a very famous book, and the controversy that ensued from it about where Virgil was buried would have been well known to Shepherd, and certainly the information that Startius was someone looking in a very different place from everybody else would have been known to Shepherd. So what is Shepherd saying? He's saying, I know where Shakespeare's buried, and the rest don't. Is there any clue that he is pointing to Westminster? Those who have studied some of the presentations I've put online will know the importance, especially in books of epigrams, of looking to an epigram that lies next to the one you're interested in to see if it gives further elucidation. Very often epigrams seem to act as almost margin notes, one to the other. Let's look at the epigram that comes directly before Epigram 17, that's Epigram 16, my imprisonment in Whittington for writing Mercurius Electicus. So Shepherd, under the name Mercurius Electicus, wrote something that was scandalous enough to have him sent to prison. What was that? Well, it was this, the Anatomy of Westminster, written by Mercurius Electicus. Also this, Mercurius Electicus, communicating the unparalleled proceedings at Westminster. One of the reasons that Shepherd wrote these Mercurius Electicus pieces, when he did and was sent to prison for them, was because his partner in crime on this whole Mercurius Electicus exercise was already in prison. So he had to take over running the Mercurius Electicus pieces. His partner in crime was one George Wharton. This is Wharton, and Wharton is known to have been a Freemason, in fact a very important one. He, in 1646, was responsible for starting up the first Masonic lodge in London at Mason's Hall, Mason's Alley, Basinghall Street. And amongst his brethren there we know was Elias Ashmole, the antiquary, astrologer, alchemist, and of course editor and collector of John Dee, William Lilly, the astronomer, and William Orchard, the mathematician. I don't know if Samuel Shepherd was also part of that, but the connection of this extremely important early Mason, George Wharton, with Samuel Shepherd, working on the secrets of Westminster with Mercurius Electicus, makes me fairly confident in thinking that Shepherd was also a Freemason. Now, I don't know how many of you will recognise this, but if you've visited Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey, you may have walked on top of it. Near this stone lie buried Geoffrey Chaucer. I'm interested particularly in these first four names. Geoffrey Chaucer, Francis Beaumont, 1616, Sir John Denham, 1669, and Sir Robert Murray, with no date. There should be a date there, 1673. Robert Murray was described by Anthony Wood, the 17th century historian, as a great patron of Rosicrucians. We know that he was accepted into a Masonic lodge in Edinburgh in 1641, one of the earliest records we have of known signed-up Freemasons. He was also the first president of the Royal Society, and it was he who persuaded Charles II, the great Freemason, to give a charter to the Royal Society. Now, Murray is buried in Poets' Corner. Honestly, one should almost think that Poets' Corner should be called Freemasons' Corner. But Murray was buried in Poets' Corner at the king's expense. He only had a couple of shillings in his pocket when he died. So he's buried there somewhere near Chaucer. Now, he was a great friend of Sir John Denham. I'll show you a picture of Sir John Denham, a very important man, very close to the king. And yes, you've guessed it, he was also a Freemason. He was surveyor of the king's works in succession to Inigo Jones, followed by Christopher Wren, both famously Freemasons. And Sir John Denham, in some documents, is described as Deputy Grand Master of the Masonic Grand Lodge of England. Well, Robert Murray doesn't seem to have left any record of his thoughts about Shakespeare or where he was buried, but his friend Sir John Denham has, we're pleased to say, in a poem to another of his great friends, Abraham Cowley. Now, Abraham Cowley, also a member of the Royal Society, just like John Denham and Robert Murray. In this poem, he writes about Abraham Cowley's death and burial amongst the ancient poets. Abraham Cowley buried somewhere very near to Chaucer. And you can see that Denham mentions Chaucer, Spenser, and the other three. With his own fires Phoebus the poet's god inspires. By Shakespeare, Jonson, Fletcher's lines, our stage's lustre Rome's outshines. These poets near our princes sleep, and in one grave their mansion keep. So Sir John Denham, member of the Royal Society, Freemason, is telling us that Shakespeare is buried in Westminster Abbey near to Chaucer, Spenser and Jonson. Also, very interestingly, he says near to Fletcher. Fletcher's been lost. He was supposed to be buried in a church in Southwark, but nobody can find out where it is that he's buried there. So I think there's an indication here that, like Edward de Vere, Fletcher also was moved by Freemasons to Poets' Corner. Another witness to the fact that Shakespeare is not buried in Stratford-upon-Avon, but in Westminster Abbey. Now, on the subject of Abraham Cowley, here he is, looking, I won't say particularly handsome, but cheerful, in a book of poems that were published shortly after his death, edited by his great friend, Thomas Spratt. Thomas Spratt's previous book was this, The History of the Royal Society of London, And Thomas Spratt, yes, indeed, was a Freemason and a member of the Royal Society, as was Abraham Cowley. But why I'm interested in Thomas Spratt is that he was also Dean of Westminster. In fact, you'll find quite a lot of the Deans of Westminster are members of the Royal Society, and it is, of course, the Dean of Westminster who has the power to decide who is buried where in Westminster Abbey. And notice on the left here this very fine engraving by Wenceslas Holler showing the links between the Royal Society of London and Freemasonry. The checked floor there, very typical of the checked floor in a Masonic hall. The two pillars at the back, Jachin and Boaz, symbolising the pillars of the porch, the Temple of Solomon. Looking around, you can see hanging on the walls all sorts of Freemasonic symbols. You don't need to go through them all. King Charles II, who is being crowned because he's the great patron of the Royal Society, of course, a Freemason himself. And on one side of him, the current head of this Royal Society. And here, the ghost of the long deceased Francis Bacon, known to Oxford as my cousin Bacon, who was the progenitor in some ways of the idea of this secret college which he described in his book The New Atlantis, a college of devoted scholars who are devoted to discovering the creation, everything they could about the creation of the world, thereby getting closer to God. Designed this, by the way, by John Evelyn, as I say, drawn by Wenceslas Holler. This is one of the things said of the Royal Society in this book by Thomas Spratt. This is a religion which is confirmed by the unanimous agreement of all sorts of worships and may serve in respect to Christianity as Solomon's porch to the temple. Well, you can't get a more Masonic remark than that. Moving on, we're now well into the 1670s now. We have a book called Fragmenta Carcharis, written by one Samuel Speed, who advertised himself as a member of that Royal Society. His grandfather was the famous John Speed, cartographer in the days of Queen Elizabeth, and you can see him there holding a compass. A lot of people wanting to hold compasses in their pictures. But Samuel Speed was no cartographer, but he was a publisher. In fact, he published this book, as you can see by the initials SS at the bottom, which was sold by booksellers of London and Westminster. I cannot tell you whether Samuel Speed was a Freemason as well as being a member of that Royal Society, but what I can say is amongst the books he published there was a great string of books that are connected to Freemasonic thought. He was a printer of books on mathematics, magic and astrology by people long connected to Freemasonic philosophy such as Agrippa of Nettlesham, John Baptiste Porter and William Ramsay. And Samuel Speed in fact published this book about the glory of the Rosy Cross, with the Regio Lucis and holy household of Rosicrucian philosophers. So the connection of Samuel Speed to books about the Rosicrucians, etc., etc., makes me strongly suppose that Samuel Speed was also a Freemason. Well, let's look at what he has to say in this book, and it occurs in something called The Legend of Duke Humphrey, Duke of St. Paul's Cathedral Walk, surveyor of the monuments and tombs of Westminster and the Temple. Often when you hear the word temple, you might be thinking of Freemasons. So this is a so-called fictional story about the legend of Duke Humphrey, who's the surveyor of monuments and tombs at Westminster and the Temple. And in this story, he invites some people to dinner. But unfortunately, his kitchen catches fire, so he's unable to give them dinner. So instead, he takes them on a tour of tombs at Westminster Abbey and says that what we can do is look at famous wits' tombs and you can feed yourself, instead of on food, you can feed yourself on wit emanating from these tombs. Let's have a look at the bit in question. But ere that happy day was fully grown, a dreadful fire consumes the kitchen down, which fire began not in his grace's house, but thither came, and burnt both rat and mouse. On which the Duke, to shun a scorching doom, perambulated to Ben Jonson's tomb, where Shakespeare, Spenser, Camden, and the rest, once rising suns, are now set in the West. Well, there we go. I admit that this is a humorous book, But so what? We've got a generally unhumorous man, member of the Royal Society, a very serious man, a publisher, as I say, possibly a Freemason, who's writing that Shakespeare is buried near Ben Jonson's tomb in Westminster Abbey. Actually, they stand by Ben Jonson's tomb and are so replete of the wit they seem to dine on there that they have to come back a second day. Next day his grace and all his guests so trim do Shakespeare find, and then they feast on him, for two such dishes at one single meal would like two thieves into the senses steal, and such a surfeit cause that by their pain they're judged unsafe to feed on wit again. So another testimony that Shakespeare is buried in Westminster Abbey. So to sum up, we've seen the testimony of John Dee, the testimony of whoever wrote the epitaph on the Stratford monument, Ben Jonson, John Milton, William Davenant, Samuel Shepherd, Samuel Speed, all telling us that there is something dodgy about the official version of where Shakespeare is buried. And all of these people we are able to connect to Freemasonry and some of them to the Royal Society. Now, who then got the idea that Shakespeare was ever buried in Stratford-upon-Avon? Where does that come from? Well, the first written account that seems to say that the poet Shakespeare is buried in Stratford-upon-Avon comes in this book by William Dugdale called The Antiquities of Warwickshire, published in 1656. Now, don't forget, that's 2 generations after the death of Stratford Shakespeare. And the question one must ask was Dugdale in ignorance? Did he genuinely think that Shakespeare was buried at Stratford-upon-Avon? That's to say, Shakespeare the poet, as opposed to William Shakespeare of Stratford. One question to ask is, was Dugdale a Freemason? I think he probably was. He was a very close friend and colleague of Elias Ashmole. Ashmole was one of the first recognised Freemasons. In fact, Dugdale's daughter Elizabeth married Elias Ashmole. He became his son-in-law. If you look very closely at the table here in this picture, you can see quite quickly signs of Freemasonry, the square and compasses. So my guess is that Dugdale probably was allied to the Freemasons. And if he's allied to the Freemasons, and the Freemasons' great creed is truth, honesty, science, history, why on earth would he tell us that Shakespeare is buried in Stratford-upon-Avon, the poet is buried in Stratford-upon-Avon? Well, let us look carefully what he actually says in the book. First of all, there is a picture of the Shakespeare monument, not showing a writer at all, but showing a wool dealer. And next to that picture, he simply transcribes the epitaphs on the monument and on the grave. Doesn't say anything there that Shakespeare is a poet. Remember, this book is primarily a book of genealogy, Warwickshire genealogy, and he gives absolutely nothing about the Shakespeare family, the Shakespeare pedigree, the connection to the Ardens or anything like that, which is rather odd when you see what he does to every other family. You actually have to turn the page to the very end of the section on Stratford-upon-Avon to see what he says, and it's written right at the end. One thing more in reference to this ancient town is observable, that it gave birth and sepulture to our late famous poet William Shakespeare, whose monument I have inserted in my discourse of the church. Now notice how he words that. Notice how he stands back. A historian would usually say, oh, King Charles was born here or something happened there. You don't say it is observable. And of course, he's right. He's telling the truth. It is observable that Stratford-upon-Avon gave birth to the poet Will Shakespeare. It is observable by looking, as the passenger, if he doesn't go by too fast, at the epitaph in the church. But that doesn't mean that our friend Dugdale, historian, actually agrees with it. Now, Dugdale was no Ben Jonson, and he was not the sort of writer who would easily and readily be able to write one thing that means another. That sort of way of using ambiguity to address the learned while sending the ignorant off in a different direction. So there is evidence to show that Dugdale struggled enormously writing this. I thank the present William Dugdale, who keeps the archives of his ancestor, for allowing me to photograph this and to show it to you. This is the manuscript of the Antiquities of Warwickshire, and that particular part where he writes about Shakespeare. You can see how difficult it was for him. Notice also at the bottom here, he's crossed out a poem. Renowned Spencer lie a thought more nigh to learned Chaucer, and rare Beaumont lie a little nearer Spencer, to make room for Shakespeare in your threefold, fourfold tomb. What is this poem? Why did he cross it out? Why did he decide it wasn't fit to be in his book? I'm going to leave you dangling on that exciting cliff edge of suspense, but all will be revealed in my next presentation, which will be uploaded presently and will be called William Bass New. I hope I've succeeded in conveying to you some idea of the furtive thread of 17th century Freemasonic personages by which the secret of Edward de Vere's burial at Westminster was conveyed to William Kent, Alexander Pope and Lord Burlington in time for them to place the Shakespeare monument upon his grave in 1740. I hope also that I have given you some enjoyment and some interest, that you will consider subscribing and pressing the bell button, and even to jerk the algorithms to press the like button. Thank you very much indeed for watching.